Hello and good evening all. Welcome to a video that I've been working on for quite some time. I think this is script iteration number 6 or 7, and it finally just felt like time to knuckle down and record it rather than continuing to go back and forth with myself. So, with year 3 of Hypercar and LMDh at Le Mans now in our rearview mirrors, or I suppose more appropriately that'd be rearview cameras because rearview mirrors are kind of outdated, but it seemed like an appropriate time to pick up and look back at what took us so darn long to get there. After all, this was supposed to have come about almost 10 years ago at this point. So, what happened? When actually, I just realized that I did not actually explain what the hell I'm talking about. We're going to be talking about DPi and why, despite the best intentions of, well, at least the best intentions and ambitions of IMSA, why DPi never went to Le Mans, which is in the video title, but anyway. When DPi launched in 2017, there was all this talk about global compatibility and Le Mans eligibility. IMSA officials would regularly hint at ongoing discussions with the ACO. Manufacturers like Cadillac were making noises about a return to the green fields of France. Scott Atherton would show up at press conferences with that knowing smile, suggesting big announcements were just around the corner. And yet, despite years of negotiations, increasingly diplomatic press releases about quote-unquote productive dialogue, and enough technical working groups to staff a small university, not a single DPi car ever turned a competitive wheel at Circuit de la Sarthe. This isn't just an examination about why some cars didn't race somewhere. Of course, that would be, a bit passé for this channel. It's a masterclass in how regulatory incompatibility, philosophical differences, economic realities, and organizational hubris can conspire to prevent what should have been a relatively straightforward collaboration. To understand why DPi never made it to Le Mans, we need to rewind to the early 2010s, the proverbial Great Divorce that made future Convergence such a tantalizing prospect. On one side of the Atlantic, you had the ACO and FIA running the World Endurance Championship. Was it called the World Endurance Championship? Yeah, that might have been 2013. Anyway, with LMP1 as the premier class. This was the era of manufacturer hybrids, Toyota, Audi, and Porsche spending what can only be described as stupid money on the most technologically advanced race cars ever built. Fight me, Formula One fans. Meanwhile, in America, the American Le Mans Series, ALMS, was dead, and IMSA had just completed its merger with Grand Am, creating what was essentially a uniquely American approach to prototype racing. Where the Europeans celebrated technological extremism and spending as much money as you could possibly find down the back of the couch cushion, IMSA prioritized cost controls and close competition, a philosophy that traced back to the original Daytona prototype era. The death of Don Panos's ALMS, which had closely followed the ACO's regulations, had left American prototype racing in something of an identity crisis. Should they follow European rules and potentially price out competitors, or continue with the Grand Am formula and create something that was uniquely suited to the North American market? IMSA's leadership, particularly Scott Atherton and Jim France, decided to chart their own course. As Atherton explained in a remarkably candid 2016 interview, "We had to acknowledge a fundamental truth. What works at Le Mans doesn't necessarily work at Daytona. Our market has different demands, different economic realities, and different competitive expectations." But this wasn't just about technical regulations. It was more about understanding that American motorsport does operate in a fundamentally different economic and, more importantly, cultural environment. Sponsors expect different things, manufacturers have different marketing priorities, and fans have different expectations about what constitutes good racing. So what exactly was the DPi concept that IMSA developed? The formula was elegantly simple in concept, even if the execution proved, as always, more complex than one hoped. You start with an LMP2 chassis from one of 4 approved constructors, Dallara, Ligier, Orica, or Riley/Multimatic. In contrast to the earlier tube frame chassis of the DP era that were truly budget-friendly, with DPi we are looking at decidedly spendier carbon fiber monocoque tubs with integrated crash structures, much tighter manufacturing tolerances, and a far greater precision in manufacturing. But here's where DPi diverged from standard LMP2. Instead of the mandatory Gibson V8 that LMP2 required, manufacturers could install their own production-based engines. I say could, like there was the option to keep the Gibson. I don't think it was an option. You had to install your own production-based engine. And this is where things got much more interesting and much more expensive than in LMP2. Cadillac brought their 6.2-liter naturally aspirated V8, internally designated the LT2 and definitely not sharing an architecture with anything else in the General Motors stable. This the shared architectural DNA with the engine and the CTSV and a number of contemporaneous Corvettes, but calling it production-based required some creative interpretation. ECR Engines essentially rebuilt the thing from the ground up for racing, with new internals, revised cooling systems, and a carefully calibrated power output targeting around 600 horsepower at 7,600 RPM. So, closer to some of the Corvette racing cars the C6 are and the C7 are then. Of course, the irony wasn't lost on those in the know. Here was yet another marketing exercise centered around a quote-unquote production-based engine that was unusually, well, not unusually for GM, but unusually for most participants, detuned to meet IMSA's performance targets. GM had actually used similar marketing with their Corvette GT programs back in the ALMS days, but the DPi application was even more artificial in its way. Mazda, on the other hand, late to the party, don't know why I didn't do these in chronological order, but there we are, took a completely different approach with their 2-liter turbocharged inline-4. This thing, like most Mazda competition engines post-rotary era, sounded like an angry swarm of mechanical bees and required constant boost pressure adjustments to remain competitive against the larger displacement competition. The engineering challenges of making a relatively small displacement engine competitive with big American V8s was fascinating from a technical standpoint, and the RT24P definitely deserves its own video when I can actually find one to photograph, but of course they did end up relying on BOP to really become competitive. That and a multi-million-dollar Evo package. Acura, on the other hand, went with a twin-turbo V6 derived from the NSX program, probably the most genuinely production-based of the DPi engines, though that is still a relative term when you look at how much time was spent developing the NSX and the fact that the engine in the car was completely bespoke for that platform. So it's not as though it was kind of the same engine that you got out of a Honda Odyssey or something. And then, of course, there was Nissan, whose VR38DETT twin-turbo V6 demonstrated that having a good engine doesn't automatically translate to having a good race car. Actually, the entire Nissan DPi program was kind of notable primarily for proving that you can have all the right components and still struggle to make them work together effectively. Also not dissimilar to the ARX-04. Be that as it may, DPi did allow limited bodywork customization in certain quote-unquote free aerodynamic zones. The ARX-05, developed with Orica and Team Penske, probably pushed this the furthest, and actually they've continued with the 06 in the same way, incorporating Acura's quote-unquote precision-crafted performance design language, including their signature jewel-eye headlight treatment, which I actually quite like, and all integrated into a very effective aerodynamic package. The styling elements, however, were not purely cosmetic. They had to work within the overall aerodynamic envelope while maintaining performance parity with other DPi entries. You always have BOP to fall back on, but you do want to be naturally competitive as well. The ARX-05's distinctive front splitter, for example, was an integral part of the car's aerodynamic balance, and we do cover it much more substantially in the detailed guide on the channel. The electronic freedom was perhaps the other most significant technical differentiator for the cars from LMP2, though it received significantly less attention than the engines and bodywork. Whereas LMP2 mandated spec Cosworth systems, DPi manufacturers could go on to develop their own electronics packages. The Cadillac used a Cosworth setup that allowed for traction control algorithms, engine mapping strategies, and data acquisition capabilities beyond what standard LMP2 cars could access. All of this was tied together by the dread fairy of modern motorsport, balance of performance, which used a combination of timing data, torque sensors, and aerodynamic analysis to equalize competition between different configurations. A typical BOP adjustment might have involved modifying restrictor sizes for naturally aspirated engines, adjusting boost pressure curves for turbocharged cars, or adding ballast to vehicles that seemed particularly slippery on high-speed tracks or just overly efficient anywhere else. The result was a formula that successfully attracted manufacturer participation while providing genuinely competitive and, more importantly, entertaining racing. By most measures, DPi achieved exactly what IMSA intended: sustainable prototype racing with strong manufacturer identity and close competition. The only problem was, nobody could actually figure out how to make it work at Le Mans. Here's where things start to get properly complicated. I was going to say fucky here, but complicated is more civilized. The ACO had two existing categories where DPi cars might theoretically compete, LMP1 and LMP2. Neither was a truly natural fit, and the reasons why reveal the deeper incompatibilities between the two regulatory philosophies. LMP2 was essentially a non-starter in my book from day one, precisely because it was the starting point for DPi. The entire point of LMP2 was to provide a cost-controlled category for privateer teams using spec engines and standardized electronics so drivers could distinguish themselves on the track. Allowing manufacturer-backed entries with custom engines and much larger budgets would fundamentally contradict the category's purpose, like allowing professionals in amateur sports leagues. Technically possible, but missing the entire point of having categories in the first place. LMP1 seemed more promising until you take a deeper look at the performance numbers, which tell a rather sobering story. The clearest comparison that we have came from Sebring 2019, where both IMSA and the World Endurance Championship raced the same weekend. The fastest LMP1 non-hybrid lap, set by the Rebellion R13 Gibson, was approximately 2.5 seconds quicker than the fastest DPi time from the Cadillac DPi VR. Now, 2.5 seconds might not sound like that much, but when you take Sebring's 3.74-mile circuit and extrapolate it out to the Le Mans 8.5-ish mile circuit, you're looking at a deficit of roughly 7 to 9 seconds per lap. Now, that doesn't take into account the fact that Sebring and Le Mans are fundamentally very different styles of circuit, but either way, that's not a performance gap. That's more of a competitive chasm that no amount of BOP could reasonably bridge without essentially creating two different categories or really annoying the LMP1 manufacturers. To put this in more of a data-driven perspective, consider the following. The Cadillac DPi VR in 2019 produced approximately 600 horsepower from its 5.5-liter V8. For clarification, they started out at 6.2 liters and then came down to 5.5 liters. Later on, for more details, Cadillac DPi VR 5-minute guide, or I think I've done an extended guide too. Anyway, it produced approximately 600 horsepower and weighed 930 kilograms, giving it a power-to-weight ratio of about 0.65 horsepower per kilo. It's also worth noting that the Cadillac is probably the DPi that could have been most easily converted to compete with LMP1s, simply because it had that whopping great
V8 motor
that could be tuned much higher than the smaller engines in the other DPi competitors. The 2019 Rebellion R13, running an LMP1 without a hybrid system, generated around 700 horsepower from its 4.5-liter naturally aspirated V8 while weighing just 833 kilos, a power-to-weight ratio of 0.84 horsepower per cag. That 30% advantage in power-to-weight is before you consider the aerodynamic differences. The LMP1 cars are designed to generate maximum downforce and minimum drag at the speeds achievable with their additional power. The DPi cars, on the other hand, were developed specifically for IMSA's different track portfolio and performance targets, and thus simply weren't really in the same aerodynamic league. The regulations didn't help either. Even with Le Mans-specific aerodynamic packages, which would have required significant development investment, the fundamental performance deficit would have remained. Dallar's chief aerodynamicist noted in a 2019 technical seminar that a Le Mans-specific kit for their DPi chassis could potentially improve efficiency by 8 to 10%, which might have narrowed the gap to 5 to 7 seconds per lap. It's still not competitive and assumes unlimited development budgets, which nobody really had. But here's the really beautiful piece of this regulatory puzzle. The ACO didn't want to create a new intermediate category specifically for DPi cars, because doing so would have essentially been admitting that their existing structure was incomplete. Meanwhile, IMSA couldn't abandon the core elements that made DPi work, balance of performance, manufacture engines, and cost controls, because then what would have been the point of participating? You just buy an LMP2 and go participate then. Scott Atherton captured this perfectly in a 2018 interview, saying that we're caught between two existing categories, neither of which provides a natural home for DPi without significant compromise. It's like that old joke about the tourist asking for directions in rural Ireland, only to be told, if I were trying to get there, I wouldn't start from here. DPi cars were trapped in a regulatory no man's land, too sophisticated for LMP2 and too compromised for LMP1. But the technical classification problems were really just symptoms of a much deeper malaise, a fundamental philosophical incompatibility between how IMSA and the ACO approached the very concept of prototype racing. The European tradition, born at Le Mans, Brooklyn's Spa, valued technological innovation and manufacturer freedom within carefully defined parameters that were only adjusted every year or so. Le Mans wasn't just a race. It was positioned as the ultimate proving ground for automotive technology, where innovations developed under racing conditions could eventually trickle down to road cars. This philosophy did explain the ACO's embrace of hybrid technology in LMP1, and diesel fuel for that matter, their resistance to active performance balancing at the highest levels, and their preference for adjusting regulations annually rather than constantly throughout seasons. The fastest, most efficient car should win because that represents the best engineering solution within the regulatory framework, and that's why it took them 6 seasons and a movie to regulate the R8 into obsolescence. Props if you get that reference. Gérard Neveu, when he was CEO of the WEC, articulated this philosophy with unusual poeticism, stating that Le Mans must remain the ultimate test of automotive excellence, where technological superiority is rewarded and the limits of engineering are constantly pushed forward. IMSA's approach was fundamentally different, prioritizing consistently close competition, financial sustainability, and manufacturer marketing opportunities. This wasn't inherently anti-technological. IMSA wasn't, advocating for stone knives and bearskins, but they viewed racing primarily as an entertainment and marketing exercise rather than a technological testbed. This perspective is, in my opinion, deeply rooted in our motorsport culture over here, where spec series like NASCAR and IndyCar have demonstrated that close competition could coexist with sophisticated technology. Well, for IndyCar anyway. NASCAR only left the 1940s about 20 years ago. But on the friendly side of the pond, the goal was never to determine which manufacturer had the best unlimited budget engineering solution, but rather to create a platform where multiple manufacturers could compete effectively while building their brands. Simon Hodgson, IMSA's VP of competition at the time, explained the dichotomy thus. Our priority is to create a platform that works for the North American market while providing our manufacturers with the marketing and competition opportunities they require. If that means actively managing performance disparities through BOP, that's a feature, not a bug. Which I don't necessarily agree, but be that as it may. Meanwhile, Monsieur Vincent Beaumenil from the ACO maintained that Le Mans must remain a true test of both speed and efficiency, where the best engineering solution prevails within the regulatory framework. Sounds like he's towing the party line alongside Mr. Neveu. These divergent philosophies created an impasse that proved unfortunately impossible to bridge despite years of discussion. Each organization was acting rationally within its own competitive milieu, but the compatibility between these systems remained impossible without a genuine willingness to compromise, sort of like attempting to merge a French haute cuisine restaurant with an American steakhouse and expecting a thematically coherent restaurant to emerge. It's technically not impossible, but given that the French don't know how to do beef and steakhouses are ill-suited for subtlety, it would take a rare genius to make it work. And since Thomas Keller is busy and Tony Bourdain is dead, well, we'll just have to wait. Rest in peace, Tony. Nothing illustrated this philosophical chasm quite like the ongoing debate over BOP. For IMSA, it was absolutely central to the DPi concept. Without it, the diverse powertrains and aerodynamic packages would have created competitive imbalances that would undermine the entire point of the series, which is variety. IMSA's BOP system was holistic, which employed not just lap time data, but also the torque sensors, boost pressure monitoring, detailed aerodynamic analyses, and even fuel consumption metrics to reach its conclusions. This granular approach to performance equalization works very well within IMSA's ecosystem. Again, there are sort of ethical arguments, but we can't deny that it creates genuinely unpredictable racing, where any of the 4 manufacturers could potentially win on any given weekend. I know there's a lot more complaints about LMDh and it seeming that Penske gets to win everything, but that's beside the point. We're talking about DPi. The system is, generally speaking, transparent, it's data-driven, and it is constantly refined based on the actual competitive results. These are positives. The ACO, on the other hand, looked at this system like somebody had suggested serving wine in coffee mugs at a state dinner. They weren't philosophically opposed to balance of performance, as they used it in GTE, but applying such measures to prototypes competing for overall victories represented a fundamental compromise of racing purity. Monsieur Pierre Fillon, the ACO president, was equally unequivocal in his assessment. Le Mans must reward ultimate performance within regulations, not artificially equalized competition. The moment we begin actively managing performance outcomes, we cease to be a true test of automotive excellence. Again, it does kind of sound like they all read from essentially the same script, but they are all, saying more or less the same thing. The irony, of course, is almost palpable in hindsight. The financial collapse of the LMP1 manufacturer programs did eventually force the ACO to embrace BOP for their top category, implementing systems that looked remarkably similar to what IMSA has been advocating for years. But that particular plot twist lay several years in the future, with a global pandemic and some economic swings and roundabouts besides. When IMSA suggested that similar BOP measures could be applied to balance DPi cars against LMP1 privateers, the ACO's response was predictably French. This created an intractable technical problem. Without BOP, certain DPi configurations would have overwhelming advantages over others, destroying the competitive balance that made the class viable. With BOP, the ACO feared establishing a precedent that could eventually undermine their premier category's technological competition. Beyond the philosophical disagreements, there were genuinely significant technical barriers that would have required substantial investment to overcome, investment that didn't make financial sense for what amounted to a single race appearance. The homologation process for Le Mans presented a particularly thorny challenge. Okay, fair enough, it's the actual crux of most of the issue. ACO regulations required extensive testing and validation procedures that went far beyond what IMSA required for the DPi cars, including comprehensive crash testing using their own protocols, aerodynamic validation in approved wind tunnels with standardized methodologies, electronics compliance testing using FIA-approved systems and procedures, fire suppression system validation according to FIA specifications, fuel system safety certification meeting specific European standards, and a partridge in a pear tree. The Mazda prototype, the RT24-P, provides an excellent case study in how these requirements would have complicated any Le Mans effort. When Multimatic undertook their comprehensive redesign of the car for the 2018 season, internally dubbed the EVO package, the development program included extensive wind tunnel testing at Multimatic's facility in North Carolina, followed by validation testing at Daytona, Sebring, and Canadian Tire Motorsport Park. This process, while rigorous by IMSA's standards, fell well short of what ACO homologation would have required, venue differences notwithstanding. The aerodynamic validation alone would have necessitated additional wind tunnel time at the approved European facilities, using specific testing protocols that may have revealed compatibility issues with the car's fundamental design. Laura Klauser, who managed Cadillac's DPi program, explained the challenge. The homologation requirements for Le Mans differ substantially from IMSA's process. Meeting both sets of requirements would require essentially developing two distinct versions of what should be the same car. Electronics presented another significant hurdle. DPi cars used manufacturer-specific electronic systems that provided the aforementioned traction control, engine mapping, and data acquisition capabilities. These systems would have required complete recertification for FIA compliance and potentially required hardware changes that could affect the car's fundamental character and performance. The safety requirements add yet another layer of complexity. This is feeling a bit laundry listy, isn't it? While DPi cars met IMSA's safety standards, the ACO had specific requirements for things like fire suppression systems, impact structures, and driver safety equipment that may have required modification to some of the existing cars. Given that most DPi manufacturers had budgeted specifically for IMSA competition, these additional homologation expenses represented a significant financial burden for dubious competitive benefits. You're essentially asking manufacturers to develop a second version of their car for a single event where it's entirely possible they won't be competitive, which is not exactly a compelling value proposition to bring to the accountants. While technical and philosophical barriers grabbed the proverbial headlines, the cold mathematics of racing economics arguably played the most decisive role in preventing DPi participation at Le Mans. Because, at the end of the day, motorsport is still a business, and businesses need to justify their expenses. DPi programs were specifically budgeted for North American competition, with total annual costs typically ranging from $2 to $5 million, depending on the manufacturer's level of involvement and the number of supported teams. These budgets covered engine development, technical support, transportation within North America, well, the US and Canada anyway, and marketing activation around the IMSA schedule. Adding Le Mans preparation would have increased these budgets by between 25% and 40% for what amounted to a single race weekend, even though you're there for a couple of weeks. Let's break down the specific additional expenditures required. Aerodynamic development for Le Mans specific package. I want to note that these are just sort of back of the napkin math calculations. I could be completely off. But anyway, aerodynamic development for a Le Mans specific package would be probably between $250,000 to $500,000. Electronics reconfiguration and homologation would have been another $100,000 to $200,000. Safety system modifications and certification would have been between $150,000 and $300,000. The additional testing program required would have been at least $300,000 to $600,000. Logistical expenses to actually get to Le Mans for the couple of weeks leading up to the race, including shipping, customs, temporary facilities, etc., would have been between $150,000 and $300,000 per car. Additional technical and operational staff to actually run the race would have been between $200,000 and $400,000 per car, and then insurance and risk management could have cost another $100,000 to $200,000. So, for a two-car effort, you're looking at an additional investment of $1.5 to $3 million on top of your existing program costs, which, depending on how much you're spending, could be more than double your budget. And that's assuming that everything goes smoothly the first time out, which, given the history of American manufacturers at Le Mans, might be optimistic. Even Ford didn't win the first time, or the second time. It's third time lucky for them. Wayne Taylor, whose team fielded championship-winning Cadillacs and later Acuras, didn't mince words when discussing the economics. Everyone talks about Le Mans as if money doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, if going there costs an extra couple $1 million per car, and you're not competitive, what's the business case? You're asking corporate executives to approve additional spending for what amounts to a very expensive marketing exercise with uncertain returns. The market relevance calculation was particularly challenging for American manufacturers. Cadillac's global sales distribution in 2018 illustrates the problem quite perfectly. They sold 93.5% of all of their cars, about 310,000 units, in North America. China accounted for 3%, about 10,000 units, Europe 1.4%, about 4.6K, and other markets were about 2.1, which is about 7,000 units. With European sales representing just 1.4% of Cadillac's global volume, justifying a massive additional investment for Le Mans participation would have required creative accounting, to say the least. Kenneth Lay's ears just pricked up somewhere. The marketing value of Le Mans does undeniably have global reach, but with Cadillac's business overwhelmingly concentrated in North America, the IMSA schedule provides significantly more relevant marketing platforms, and you've already budgeted for it. Acura arguably faced an even more challenging calculation. While, yes, Honda does have global reach and have competed at Le Mans before, Acura is Honda's luxury brand exclusively for North America and thus has no European presence whatsoever. While HPD has, of course, successfully campaigned prototypes at Le Mans in the past, the Acura brand would have gained no direct marketing benefit from European exposure, and while technically you could have rebranded the ARX-05 as a Honda, it's, again, swings and roundabouts. Mazda, on the other hand, had a more complex calculation. With genuine global presence and a legitimate claim to the Le Mans heritage, including, of course, the 91 victory with the 787B, they do have a stronger marketing case. However, they were out of money. They were already stretching their resources to remain competitive in IMSA by itself, after the troubled debut of the RT24P in 2017, they went and had to do this extensive redesign with Multimatic and then switched from SpeedSource to Team Yost as their operational partner after Team Yost's capacity was freed up following Audi's departure from Le Mans in 2016. These expenditures, which were estimated at $7 to $10 million over 2 seasons, consumed whatever budgetary flexibility might have existed for additional programs at the start. Nissan, similarly, had and has a global reach, but given that their DPi was never quite as competitive as the other outings, the additional authorization of spend to go be equally, if not more, uncompetitive at Le Mans would have probably never been justifiably insane. But John Doonan, who managed Mazda's DPi program at the time and would later go on to head IMSA, was candid about the financial constraints. We're already operating at the edge of what our motorsport budget can support to be competitive in IMSA. Adding Le Mans would require either reducing our IMSA effort or requesting additional funding that simply isn't available in the current economic environment. The financial picture becomes even more challenging when you consider the opportunity costs. For the same money required to develop a Le Mans-specific package and compete for one weekend, manufacturers could fund additional IMSA rounds, enhance their existing technical programs, or add more cars to their factory IMSA programs. Beyond the visible technical, philosophical, and economic barriers, there was an underlying political dimension to the DPi saga that revealed how international motorsport organizations attempt to navigate competing interests while sticking to their underlying guiding principles. I said underlying twice in one sentence, I'm sorry. Both IMSA and the ACO harbored broader ambitions about shaping the future of global prototype racing. The ACO, as guardians of Le Mans and partners with the FIA in the World Endurance Championship, naturally viewed their regulatory approach as the global standard to which others should adapt, and with almost a century of history at the forefront of sports car racing, it was quite understandable from their perspective. They operated the world's most prestigious endurance race, had decades of experience with prototype regulations, and maintained relationships with manufacturers across every continent. I'm very curious to hear about the Antarctic manufacturers, but you know what I mean. IMSA, with their demonstrable success with the DPi formula and robust North American manufacturer engagement, saw an opportunity to break out and influence global prototype regulations in a direction that prioritized sustainable manufacturer participation over technological extremism. Their approach had attracted 4 major manufacturers to a series that previous ALMS/Grand Am efforts had struggled to populate consistently. These competing visions created a political standoff where neither organization wanted to be seen as capitulating to the other. Every technical compromise suggested weakness, every regulatory concession implied their fundamental approach might be flawed. Gilles Simon, the former FIA technical director, provided a rare moment of clarity at a 2018 motorsport engineering conference, stating that we are watching 2 regulatory philosophies compete for the soul of prototype racing. Both organizations believe sincerely that their approach represents the future, and neither wants to be subsumed by the other. This observation highlighted the political subtext of what superficially appeared to be merely technical disagreements. The regulatory approach that ultimately prevailed would shape prototype racing for a decade or more, a prize I think inarguably worth fighting for, even at the cost of short-term cooperation. The public communications from both organizations during this period were a masterclass in diplomatic non-commitment. Scott Hatherton regularly expressed optimism about eventual DPi inclusion at Le Mans, saying things like, we continue to have productive discussions with our friends at the ACO. There's a shared desire to find a solution that works for everyone. Meanwhile, ACO statements were more measured, typically emphasizing ongoing dialogue and exploring possibilities rather than any concrete progress towards a specific solution. This public dance served both organizations' interests at the time. For IMSA, the prospect of Le Mans eligibility remained a useful selling point for manufacturers considering DPi programs. You could join a successful American series with the eventual possibility of global competition. For the ACO, appearing open to accommodation helped maintain good relations with an important partner organization without requiring actual regulatory concessions. Behind closed doors, however, sources suggest the discussions were considerably more fraught. A senior IMSA manufacturer representative, speaking anonymously to Motorsport magazine in 2019, described the negotiations with barely concealed frustration, saying, "It was like watching 2 chess grandmasters play to an inevitable draw, while insisting they were seeking a decisive result. Lots of moves, extensive analysis, but no real intention of reaching a conclusion that would require either side to admit their approach was incomplete." The timing of various announcements and regulatory changes suggests careful coordination, potentially one-upsmanship, to avoid direct confrontation while maintaining perceived advantages in negotiating positions. When IMSA announced modifications to the DPi regulations, the ACO would often simultaneously or shortly thereafter announce developments in their own prototype categories, ensuring that neither organization appeared to be following the other's lead. When IMSA and the ACO were engaging in their elaborate diplomatic dance around DPi compatibility, the ACO was simultaneously developing what they hoped would be their own solution to the LMP1 cost crisis: Hypercar. The original Hypercar concept, announced in June of 2018, represented a potentially revolutionary approach to top-level endurance racing. Instead of purpose-built prototypes, the category would feature racing versions of limited production hypercars, with mandatory connections to road-going vehicles. Revolutionary, that is, while returning to the sport's roots, so not actually revolutionary at all, just dusting off an old concept and calling it a new one. The initial requirements were actually quite exciting. Cars had to be based on production hypercars with at least 20 road-going examples. Racing versions had to maintain clear visual connections to their road-going counterparts. There were options for a hybrid system with regulated deployment parameters, strict cost controls through budget caps and standardized components, and target lap times of about 3 minutes 20 at Le Mans. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this vision attracted tremendous manufacturer interest, including Aston Martin with the Valkyrie, Toyota with their GR Supersport concept, potentially Mercedes-AMG with the Formula One-derived AMG 1, which go back and forth on whether or not that's feasible. But McLaren was exploring options beyond the Senna, and Glickenhaus was, of course, interested with the SCG-007. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like we might witness the return of another golden age at Le Mans, when the world's most extraordinary road cars could come to prove themselves in the ultimate endurance test. The Aston Martin Valkyrie, with its Cosworth-built naturally aspirated V12 and Adrian Newey's aerodynamic genius, appeared to be the perfect standard-bearer for this philosophy. Gérard Neveu, then CEO of the WEC, articulated this romantic vision. "We are returning to the spirit of Le Mans' golden age, when the greatest road cars in the world came to prove themselves in the ultimate test of endurance." Sounds like I just borrowed this for the script. These are machines that will quicken the pulse on road and track alike. The concept promised to bridge the gap between road and racing in ways that we hadn't really been seeing since the GT1 era. You can imagine the spectacle. You'd have Valkyries battling GR Supersports and AMG 1s around Circuit de la Sarthe, with each car representing the absolute pinnacle of their manufacturer's road car technology, and it was still something you could go see in the showroom the next weekend, if you lived in an extremely wealthy metropolitan area. But then, of course, reality intervened, as it tends to do. Between 2018 and the category's eventual 2021 debut, the regulations underwent what can only be described as systematic dilution. The mandatory connection to production hypercars was eliminated, the performance window was raised from 3 minutes 20 to approximately 3 minutes 30, technical freedoms were reduced through stricter controls on aerodynamics and chassis design, and the balance of performance theory, the system the ACO had so long resisted for prototypes, was quietly introduced. By the time Le Mans Hypercar debuted in 2021, the only remnant of the original concept was the name itself and some loose styling cues. Toyota's GR010 Hybrid, while incorporating elements from the GR Supersport concept, is essentially an overweight version of the TS050, with some slight modifications to fit the new regulations. Ferrari's 499P, stunning though it is, shares little beyond some loose visual inspiration with any road-going Ferrari, and in fact, really more leverages their Formula One engineers than anything else. The most visible casualty of this regulatory evolution was Aston Martin, who withdrew the Valkyrie program in February 2020. Of course, they have since returned, but that's beside the point. Tobias Moers, then Aston Martin CEO, barely concealed his frustration, saying, "The regulations have moved so far from the original concept that the Valkyrie race program no longer represents a viable proposition for us. We entered this project to race a modified version of an extraordinary road car, not to build a prototype with hypercar styling cues." And yeah, they have returned to the category, so don't, pick up a keyboard and try and remind me that that's happened, because I'm perfectly aware, but their Le Mans performance this year does show that they have a ways to go to catch up to the more established manufacturers, and the question mark of what might have been had they stuck with it from the beginning is going to have to remain just that. This remarkably direct criticism, however, highlights exactly how substantially the regulations evolved away from their original revolutionary concept. What started as a platform for road car-derived hypercars has transformed into yet another prototype formula with some manufacturer styling elements, basically LMP1 with brand identity. The technical evolution provided perhaps the clearest illustration of this drift. The initial framework included production-based monocoques derived from road cars, aerodynamics limited to road-relevant shapes and downforce levels, engine architectures with substantial commonality to production units, suspension and transmission concepts derived from road car technology. By the final regulations, on the other hand, these requirements had been systematically diluted. Now we had purpose-built racing chassis with no road car derivation requirements. There was back-to-prototype level aerodynamics that retained only some limited styling elements from the original. Race-specific engines were permitted with increasingly tenuous production connections, and of course all other systems could be much more racing optimized with only minimal road relevance. A senior aerodynamicist that was involved in one of the earlier manufacturer hypercar studies explained the technical quandary thus. The road cars were simply too different from each other. The Valkyrie generated downforce through completely different principles than the Toyota concept or the Mercedes-AMG 1. Balancing these fundamentally different aerodynamic philosophies while maintaining visual identity proved nearly impossible without adopting more conventional racing solutions. This technical reality forced a choice between preserving the original hypercar concept with potentially significant performance disparities, or creating a more balanced competitive environment by moving towards controlled prototype-like regulations. The ACO chose competitive balance over conceptual purity, which was a pragmatic decision, but one that fundamentally altered the category's character. And here's where we can indulge in a bit of alternate history what-ifs, if you will. What if the ACO had found a way to accommodate DPi cars during the 2018 to 2020 period or so, when the LMP1 grids were looking increasingly sparse? Picture the 2019 Le Mans starting grid, for instance, with DPi participation. Instead of the actual 8-car LMP1 field, you might have seen Toyota as the sole representative in LMP1, in LMP1 hybrid, that is. In LMP1 non-hybrid, we'd probably have 2 Rebellion R13s, an SMP Racing BR1-AER, that's the engine supplier, 2 cars, Dragon Speed BR1 with a Gibson engine, probably 1 car, and then in our hypothetical DPi category, probably 3 to 4 of the Cadillac DPi VR, probably cars from Wayne Taylor Racing, Action Express, and JDC Miller Motorsports, 2 Acuras ARX-05s from Team Penske, 1 or 2 cars from Mazda Team Yost running the RT24-P, and then maybe a Nissan DPi. I'm 50-50 on whether or not that would actually have come to pass, but it would be a nice way to fill out the field a little bit. Actually, I don't think I included one in the Assetto Corsa footage that we've been watching, so evidently when I recorded that, I wasn't feeling quite so optimistic. Anyway, this combined field of 15 to 17 cars or so would have represented a significant improvement over the actual entry, creating multiple racing narratives beyond the inevitable Toyota domination of, well, the hybrid category and LMP1 in total. Technical diversity would have been equally enjoyable. Toyota would, of course, been running their 2.4-liter twin-turbo V6 hybrid that produced about 1,000 horsepower. Rebellion would have the 4.5-liter naturally aspirated V8, generating approximately 700. SMP's 2.4-liter turbo V6 made about 600 horsepower. Cadillac, with their now 5.5-liter naturally aspirated V8, would have been running about 600 horsepower, as would all the other DPIs, unless there was some allowance for up-rating, shall we say, at which point I don't think it's unreasonable to think the Cadillac probably would have been able to make about 750 without too much stress. Acura, 3.5-liter twin-turbo V6, probably between 600 and 700 if the reins were taken off, such as it is. Mazda probably would have struggled a little bit with their 2-liter turbo straight 4 to produce more than about 600 horsepower. And then if Nissan was there, that 3.8-liter twin-turbo V6, oh man, I don't even know. I don't know that much about the on-rack DPI or whatever the heck it was called. But given that there are creative tuning applications for GTRs that can really get them going, yeah, that might be, another 700 plus horsepower contender. But either way, would there have been distinct performance tiers? Of course. Toyota hybrids would have dominated overall. LMP1 non-hybrid would have probably fought, for the best of the rest. And then the DPi cars, unless they were allowed to turn their engines up, would pretty much have battled amongst themselves, while potentially challenging for podiums if the faster categories encountered reliability issues. But that's precisely what makes Le Mans special. It's a multi-class race, where different categories fundamentally develop different stories over the 24-hour duration. DPI cars probably wouldn't have been in the mix for the overall win, but they would have had fun, and they would have created compelling narratives around manufacturer pride and reliability competitions, and so on and so forth. Jordan Taylor, who drove several championship-winning DPI cars and continues to now race LMDhs, offered his perspective in, of all things, a Reddit discussion. Raw pace, we'd have been behind the LMP1s for sure, but over 24 hours, with our reliability record, I think we could have surprised people. Le Mans has this funny way of rewarding consistency over pure speed. The reliability factor is particularly intriguing when you consider that both 2018 and 19 saw significant attrition amongst the LMP1 non-hybrid entries, and Audi's greatest strength during their domination of the race came primarily from reliability and efficiency, not outright pace. SMP Racing's BR1s were notoriously fragile, and even the Rebellion entries frequently suffered technical problems. DPI cars, on the other hand, developed with IMSA's reliability-focused philosophy, might have been able to capitalize on some of these opportunities. By 2020, it became increasingly clear that retrofitting DPI into the existing Le Mans ecosystem just wasn't going to happen. The technical barriers were substantial, the philosophical differences were fundamental, and the economic case was increasingly weak. Instead, attention shifted toward creating new regulations that would achieve global compatibility from the ground up. The result was LMDh, Le Mans Daytona Hybrid, or Le Mans Daytona Hypercar, depending on who you ask, announced in January 2020 as a joint project between IMSA and the ACO/FIA. And here's where the irony goes spinal tap, that is to say, turned up to 11. LMDh is basically DPI, with a standardized hybrid system bolted on and some regulatory tweaks for global compatibility. Let's compare the core architectures. In DPI, we had LMP2-based chassis from approved constructors. You had manufacturer-specific engines, limited bodywork customization, the balance of performance system, and manufacturer-specific electronics. In LMDh, you had LMP2-based chassis from approved constructors, manufacturer-specific engines, limited bodywork customization. That was slightly more restricted than you had in DPI. A balance of performance system, now with global coordination. A standardized hybrid and EU system, which is the Bosch-Williams extract package. Bosch doing the ECU, Williams does the batteries, I think, and extract does the gearbox, of course. The similarities are in fact so pronounced that Cadillac's initial LMDh development was initially referred to as DPI Gen 2 before the official designation was established. A technical director for a major LMDh manufacturer, I say that like there's minor ones, acknowledged the lineage with refreshing directness, saying, if you strip away the hybrid system and a few regulatory details, we're looking at a direct evolution of DPI. The DNA is unmistakable. And yeah, frankly it is. What makes this particularly fascinating is the fact that it represents a de facto acknowledgement by the ACO that the core DPI concept was viable all along. After years of resistance to what they characterized as an oversimplified approach to prototype racing, the ACO essentially adopted the DPI philosophy for their premier category. The transformation was disguised, of course, by new terminology and technical modifications, but the underlying shift was unmistakable. The ACO moved from advocating unlimited technological competition, which is what gave us the billion-dollar LMP1 hybrid programs, to embracing cost controls, BOP, and manufacturer-styled prototypes that still had an underlying common architecture. This was precisely the approach IMSA had pioneered with DPI. A senior IMSA official, speaking anonymously to Racer magazine in 2021, couldn't resist noting the irony. After being told for years that our approach wasn't sophisticated enough for Le Mans, it's interesting to see how many DPI principles have suddenly become acceptable. Sometimes being right too early looks a lot like being wrong. The standardized hybrid system has served multiple functions beyond pure performance. Technically, it provided a common electrical architecture that simplified global homologation. Politically, allowed the ACO to maintain their narrative of technological progressivism while adopting cost control measures that they had previously resisted. Economically, it helped keep costs in control by ensuring nobody spent millions looking for a spare megajoule. But perhaps most importantly, the hybrid system provided what might be called a technological fig leaf, a sufficiently advanced component that justified the regulatory shift toward more controlled competition. The ACO could embrace IMSA's cost-conscious approach while pointing to the hybrid system as evidence of continued technological relevance. There's further irony in the fact that the Le Mans Hypercar rules don't require you to run a hybrid system, and in fact I think all of the cars that aren't running hybrid systems are built to LMH rather than LMDh, but we'll gloss over that for now. A powertrain engineer who was involved in both DPi and LMDh development observed with barely concealed amusement that we've added a standardized hybrid system to justify removing freedoms elsewhere. It's like putting a bow tie on a bulldog. It doesn't make it formal attire, but it helps everyone pretend it's dressed for dinner. I wish I'd come up with that line. The negotiation process that created LMDh also revealed how much the balance of power had shifted since the original DPi at Le Mans discussions. IMSA's successful demonstration of sustainable manufacturer engagement through the DPi rule set gave them significant leverage when Convergence talks began in earnest. Instead of IMSA being forced to adapt their cars to European requirements, the final LMDh regulations landed remarkably close to the original DPi concept. IMSA had effectively anchored the negotiation with their successful formula, and the compromise ended up looking suspiciously like what they had wanted all along. Though DPi never competed at Le Mans, the class's influence on global prototype racing can't be overstated. I mean, it could be, but it would be difficult. The lessons learned from both its successes in IMSA and its failure to achieve global compatibility directly shaped the subsequent LMDh/LMH convergence. The DPi formula demonstrated conclusively that meaningful manufacturer participation could be sustained at budget levels significantly below that of LMP1 hybrid, while still providing brand identity and marketing value. This lesson proved crucial as global motorsports entered a more cost-conscious era. The numbers further illustrate this story. Cadillac's DPi program was reportedly costing somewhere between $15 to $20 million annually for quite a few cars. Acura's DPi program was between $10 and $15 million annually, while Toyota's LMP1 hybrid program and Audi's and Porsche's was spending somewhere between 80 and 100 million euros annually. This dramatic cost disparity highlights the financial unsustainability of the LMP1 hybrid era, which is a lesson that the ACO was forced to acknowledge as manufacturer after manufacturer abandoned the WEC. IMSA's willingness, on the other hand, to create a category that was specifically tailored to their market needs, rather than simply adopting international regulations, ultimately strengthened their negotiating position when convergence discussions began. By demonstrating that they had a successful alternative model, IMSA gained leverage that might have been absent had they simply followed the ACO's lead. Graham Goodwin, editor of Daily Sports Car, observed in a 2021 retrospective that the success of DPi gave IMSA a seat at the table they wouldn't otherwise have had. Without DPi's success, IMSA would have been negotiating from a position of weakness rather than strength. Perhaps the most significant lesson from this is the importance of establishing global compatibility from the outset rather than attempting to retrofit alignment later. The challenges faced in reconciling two established regulatory frameworks proved far more complex than creating a new, jointly developed platform. Monsieur Fillon acknowledged this in announcing LMDh. What we learned from DPi is that alignment must be a foundational principle, not an afterthought. LMDh represents this new approach. This manifested in the meticulous joint development of the LMDh regulations, with working groups including representatives from both sanctioning bodies, chassis constructors, and from potential manufacturers. Unlike DPi, which was developed primarily by IMSA with little to no ACO input, LMDh emerged from an explicitly collaborative process. While much of this discussion has focused on why DPi never competed at Le Mans, it's worth examining what the ACO lost through their regulatory inflexibility during the crucial 2018 to 2020 period. The collapse of manufacturer participation in LMP1 hybrid left the World Endurance Championship with a top category dominated and, populated solely by Toyota as the only manufacturer, competing against a small field of privateer non-hybrid entries. This competitive imbalance created races that were essentially predetermined and hardly the spectacle the ACO desired. The 2018 to 2019 quote-unquote super season featured just 8 full-season LMP1 entries, with only 5 remaining by the season's end. This anemic grid contrasted rather sharply with IMSA's flourishing DPi class, which featured 11 entries across 4 manufacturers during the same period. Had the ACO been more flexible regarding DPi's inclusion, perhaps creating a transitional category or offering one-off Le Mans invitations, they might have bolstered their grid with competitive, manufacturer-backed entries during this lean period. Instead, they maintained their regulatory purity at the cost of on-track spectacle. A veteran team principal who competed in both series from time to time characterized the situation as The ACO had empty grid spaces and manufacturers eager to fill them, yet couldn't find a workable compromise. That's not principled, it's just stubborn. Beyond competitive implications, the absence of DPi at Le Mans represented a significant missed marketing opportunity. Cadillac's potential return to Le Mans would have generated substantial interest in the North American market, and eventually did when they showed up in 2023. Mazda's historical connection to the race, including their iconic 91 victory, created natural marketing narratives that remain to this day unexploited. Ooh, we should get Mazda MX-5 Cup around Circuit de la Sarthe. That would be fantastic. Might get a little slow on the long straights, but maybe they could do the Bugatti circuit. That would be delightful. I love MX-5 Cup. Anyway, for the ACO, inclusion of American manufacturers would have strengthened the race's appeal in the North American market, supporting their ongoing efforts to expand their presence in the United States. They're now getting around to this, but would have been good beforehand. And if they could find a way to add Sebring back to the schedule in addition to Lone Star Le Mans, they would benefit further. The story of DPi's absence from Le Mans ultimately represents what I find to be a rather fascinating case study in how best intentions can be derailed by the collision between noble aspirations and stubborn organizations. What initially appeared as a straightforward goal, allowing IMSA's premier class to compete in motorsport's most prestigious race, revealed itself to be an ambition fraught with technical incompatibilities, philosophical differences, economic constraints, and political calculations that proved insurmountable within the existing regulatory framework. Yet, in failure lay the seeds of ultimate success. The lessons learned during the DPi era directly informed the subsequent convergence achieved through LMDh and LMH. The very barriers that prevented DPi from competing at Le Mans became the blueprint for what needed to be addressed in creating truly global prototype regulations. When Cadillac and Porsche finally arrived at Le Mans in 2023 under the LMDh regulations, there was a certain poetic justice to the moment. The manufacturer that couldn't take their DPi cars to Circuit de la Sarthe ultimately reached their destination via a longer and more circuitous route, and now have brought friends in the form of BMW, not yet Acura, and others, with some manufacturers actually planning to run WEC-only programs using cars built to the LMDh regulations. Wayne Taylor, whose team now campaigns Cadillac's IMSA LMDh program after years of DPi success, captured this perfectly. We spent years talking about going to Le Mans, and it never happened. Now we're going with LMDh instead. The destination is the same, only the vehicle has changed. Sometimes the scenic route isn't by choice, but you still end up where you were trying to go. The DPi class served as an essential prototype in the truest sense. Not the final solution, but a successful test of concepts that would eventually inform the global approach. The cars may never have raced at Circuit de la Sarthe, but their influence most certainly did. And at the risk of waxing a little poetical, perhaps there's a broader lesson here about motorsport's relationship with innovation. Successful technical evolution often comes not from revolutionary leaps, but from iterative refinement, even when that refinement initially appears as failure. DPi's inability to compete at Le Mans wasn't simply a dead end, but more a necessary detour on the path to a sustainable global prototype formula. As we watch Cadillacs and Porsches battle Toyotas and Ferraris under the current convergence regulations, and I do use battle as, a little bit of an aspirational phrase, although, Porsche's been doing fairly well, and Cadillac got pole this year. So, we're witnessing not just the culmination of recent regulatory efforts, but the indirect legacy of the DPi experiment, a class that, in failing to reach Le Mans, ultimately helped create the pathway for others to succeed. Well, it's happened again. You've wasted another perfectly good hour listening to Lensler. For this week's shameless plugs for other content on the channel, we've covered the Cadillac and Acura DPIs in their own videos, and for a deep dive into what made Daytona Prototype, the original iterations, so successful, there's a pretty extensive video covering that as well. We've touched on most of the original crop of LMDh and Le Mans Hypercar entrants, and I just have to get to a track again sometime soon to shoot the newer ones, and then we'll get those videos out as well. But with moving house next week and a baby due in September, it's not likely to happen before next year, unfortunately. Anyway, for this week's call to action not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube,
like, comment, subscribe.
Remember to write thank you notes, especially to people who don't actually deserve it, just to mess with their heads a bit. Thank you, as always, for watching, and I wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.